What was a medieval yeoman? It's a simple question with a complicated answer. He wasn't a lord, he wasn't a knight, and he certainly wasn't a serf. He was something in between. He was part of a growing middle class in a world that didn't really like the middle. A medieval society was supposed to be simple. You had those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The clergy, the nobility, and the peasantry. The yeoman didn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. That's what makes him so interesting. The most important thing to understand about the yeoman was his freedom. In an age where most people were unfree, this was a huge deal. A serf, the typical medieval farmer was tied to the land. He belonged to the lord of the manor as much as the trees and the soil did. He couldn't leave without the lord's permission. He couldn't marry without permission. His children were born into the same state of bondage. The yeoman was different. He was a free man. He could come and go as he pleased. He could buy and sell land. He could marry whomever he chose. He answered to the king's law, not just the whims of a local lord. This freedom was almost always tied to land. The yeoman was a man of property. He might own his land outright, what was called a freehold. This made him incredibly independent. He paid his taxes to the crown, and that was that. He was his own master, or he might be a tenant farmer, but not the kind we think of today. He often held a long-term lease, sometimes for generations. This gave him security. He knew the land his grandfather worked would be passed to his son. He had a stake in the community, a reason to improve his farm, and a foundation of wealth that set him apart. The amount of land varied. There was no exact acreage that made you a yeoman, but a common figure was somewhere between 30 and 120 acres. This was far more than the small strips a serf might work. It was enough land to produce a surplus. He could feed his family and have enough left over to sell at market. This generated cash. And cash meant power. It meant he could buy more land, better tools, or finer clothes for his wife. It separated him from the hand-to-mouth existence of the peasantry. He was comfortable, not rich. Now, he was a man of substance. The word Yeoman itself is a bit of a mystery. No one is entirely sure of its origin. Something it comes from young man, perhaps referring to a retainer or attendant in a noble household. Others think it might be connected to a specific region or a particular dialect. By the 14th century, though, the term had a clear meaning. It described a commoner of respectable standing, a freeholder, a man who stood below the gentry but well above the laborers and serfs. He was the backbone of rural England. He occupied a difficult social space. He wasn't part of the gentry, the class of landowners who didn't have to perform manual labor. A yeoman worked. He put his own hands to the plow. He mended his own fences. But he wasn't seen as just another peasant. He might employ a laborer or two, especially during the harvest. He could afford better things. His house was sturdier. His diet was better. He might even be able to read and write, or at least understand numbers well enough to manage his farm and accounts. Think of society as a pyramid. At the very top was the king. Below him were the great dukes and earls. Then came the lesser barons and knights. This was the aristocracy, the ruling class. At the very bottom was a huge base of serfs and landless laborers. The yeoman stood on the slope between them. He was a commoner, yes, but a proud and independent one. He was a taxpayer, a property owner, and, as we'll see, a soldier. He was the living proof that the rigid medieval system was starting to change. He represented a new kind of person, one whose worth came not from his bloodline, but from his land, his labor, and his liberty. A yeoman's life was ruled by the seasons. His world was his land, and his clock was the sun. His work was hard and constant, but it was for himself and his family. This was a profound difference from the life of a serf, who labored mostly for a lord. The yeoman's sweat built his own prosperity. His farm was a small, self-contained world. Picture a solid farmhouse, not a hovel. It was likely built of timber frame with wattle and daub walls and perhaps a stone foundation. It was bigger than a peasant's hut. Inside there might be a main hall, a large room with a central hearth for cooking and warmth. Smoke would simply find its way out through a hole in the thatched or shingled roof. Over time, these houses became more complex, with separate chambers for sleeping, offering a degree of privacy unknown to poorer folk. The house was a symbol of his status. It was built to last. Around the house were the farm buildings. A barn to store grain, a byre for the cattle, a sty for the pigs. These were vital assets. His livestock were his engines and his wealth. A team of oxen was essential for plowing the heavy soil. Without them, you couldn't farm on any serious scale. He would also have a cow or two for milk, which his wife would turn into butter and cheese. Pigs were the medieval savings account. They could forage for themselves and be slaughtered in the autumn to provide salted meat for the winter. He might also have chickens scratching in the yard and a flock of sheep on a nearby pasture, providing wool that could be spun at home or sold. The work year followed a relentless cycle. In the late winter and early spring, the fields had to be prepared. This meant plowing. The yeoman would guide his oxen up and down the long strips of his fields, turning over the earth. It was slow, back-breaking work, and then came the sowing of seeds, mostly barley, wheat, rye, and oats. He had to be a skilled farmer, knowing when to plant, how to rotate his crops to keep the soil fertile, and how to manage the drainage of his fields. In summer was a time of growth and constant vigilance. He had to weed the fields, a task that often fell to his children. He mended fences to keep stray animals from eating the young crops. He tended to his vegetable garden near the house, which provided crucial additions to the family's diet. This was a time of anxious waiting, of watching the sky for rain or sun. Late summer and early autumn brought the harvest. This was the most intense period of the year. Everyone had to work, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent. The Yeoman might even hire a couple of landless laborers to help bring in the crop quickly before the weather turned. They would cut the grain with scythes and sickles, bind it into sheaves, and haul it back to the barn for threshing. A successful harvest meant security for the winter. A bad harvest could mean disaster. The yeoman's family was a vital economic unit. His wife was not just a housekeeper, she was a partner in the enterprise. She managed the dairy, churned the butter, and made the cheese. She tended the vegetable garden and the chickens. She spun wool or flax into thread. She brewed the ale, which was a staple of the daily diet for everyone, including children, as water was often unsafe to drink. She cooked, cleaned, and raised the children, teaching them the skills they would need to run their own farms one day. The children started working as soon as they were able. They scared birds from the crops, collected eggs, and helped with 100 other small tasks. His diet was much better than a serf's. The foundation was bread, dense and dark, made from the grain he grew. He ate a lot of pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew that simmered over the fire all day. But, unlike the poor, he had regular access to meat from his own animals, especially pork and bacon. He had cheese, eggs, and butter. He drank his own ale, he was self-sufficient. What he didn't produce himself, he could often buy at the local market with the cash from selling his surplus grain or wool. This life wasn't easy. It was a life of physical toil, vulnerability to bad weather and disease. But it was a life of independence. The yeoman was master of his small domain, he worked his own land, fed his own family from it, and stood as a proud, solid figure in his community. The image of the yeoman is inseparable from the longbow. While he was a farmer first, he was also a soldier. And in the 14th and 15th centuries, the English yeoman archer was the most feared soldier in Europe. He changed the nature of warfare. He proved that a common man on foot, with a piece of yew wood and a lifetime of training, could defeat a wealthy, armor-clad knight on a war horse. The English longbow was a formidable weapon. It was not a simple bow. It was tall, often over 6 feet, and made from a single stave of yew. The best bows used wood from the trunk where the resilient sapwood and the strong heartwood met, giving it a natural spring and power. The draw weight was immense, often over 100 pounds and sometimes as high as 180 pounds. To draw such a bow required incredible strength, not just in the arms, but in the back and shoulders. It was not a weapon you could just pick up and use. Becoming a longbowman was a lifelong commitment. English kings understood the bow's potential and passed laws to encourage its practice. The Assize of Arms of 1252 required all men of a certain property value, a category that fit the yeoman perfectly, to own a bow and practice regularly. Sunday afternoons were often given over to archery practice on the village green after church. The fathers taught their sons from a young age, starting them on smaller bows and gradually increasing the size and power as the boys grew stronger. This constant training was etched into their very bones. Skeletons of longbowmen found from this period show significant physical development. They have enlarged left arms, thickened wrist bones, and twisted spines, all testament to the thousands of hours spent drawing the heavy yew bow. In battle, the yeoman archer was a devastating force. He was not a lone skirmisher. He fought in organized companies, often under the command of a local knight or lord. On the battlefield, they would work together, planting sharpened stakes in the ground before them to protect against cavalry charges. Then they would wait for the enemy to advance. When the enemy, often heavily armored French knights, came within range, the command would be given. The sky would darken with arrows. A trained longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute. An army with several thousand archers could release a terrifying storm of projectiles. These weren't just nuisance arrows, they were heavy. Armor-piercing arrows, fitted with bodkin points, long, thin spikes of iron designed to punch through mail and plate armor. Even if an arrow didn't penetrate the thickest plate, It could find a gap at the joints, hit the knight's horse, or strike with enough force to knock a man from his saddle. The great English victories of the Hundred Years' War, like Crécy 1346, Poitiers 1356, and Agincourt 1415, were built on the backs of the yeoman archers. At Agincourt, a small, tired English army faced a much larger French force on a muddy field. The French knights, weighed down by their armor, had to charge across the boggy ground. They were perfect targets. The English yeomen stood their ground, loosed their arrows, and annihilated the flower of French chivalry. The battle was a social statement as much as a military one. It demonstrated that birth and wealth were no match for discipline, training, and superior technology in the hands of common men. Serving in a king's army also had a profound effect on the yeoman himself. It was a source of income. He was paid a wage for his service, which was a good supplement to his farm earnings. It took him beyond the boundaries of his village and his county. He saw new lands, new cities, and different cultures. He fought alongside men from all over England, building a sense of shared English identity. He earned respect. A yeoman who returned home from a successful campaign in France was a man of status and experience. He had proven his worth not just with a plow, but with a bow. This military role reinforced his position in society. He was not just a farmer, he was a defender of the realm, a man whose skills were vital to the king and the kingdom. The longbow gave the yeoman a deadly power, and with that power came a new level of confidence and pride. The yeoman's importance was not confined to his fields or the battlefield. He was also a central figure in his local community. His freedom, his property, and his respectable standing gave him responsibilities and a voice in local affairs. He was part of the machinery that made the village and the county run. His legal status was key. As a free man, he had rights in the king's courts. This was a crucial protection. If a powerful neighbor, even a lord, tried to seize his land or cheat him in a deal, the yeoman could take him to court. He might not always win, but he had legal recourse. A serf had almost no such rights. The yeoman was a lawful man, someone who was recognized by the law and expected to abide by it. One of his most important civic duties was serving on a jury. In the medieval English legal system, local disputes, from property boundaries to criminal accusations, were often settled by a jury of one's peers. And who were these peers? They were the good men and true of the neighborhood. The yeoman, as a property-owning, respectable freeman, was exactly the kind of person called for jury duty. This gave him real power. He and his fellow jurors would listen to the evidence and deliver a verdict. They decided the fates of their neighbors. This role as a juror meant he was trusted to be honest and fair-minded. It put him in a position of local authority. Beyond the courtroom, the yeoman often held local offices. The government of medieval England was surprisingly decentralized. The king and his sheriffs relied on local people to keep the peace and enforce the law at the village level. These unpaid positions were filled by men like the yeoman. He might be elected or appointed as the village constable. In this role, he was responsible for raising the hue and cry to catch a criminal, holding suspects until the sheriff arrived, and generally maintaining order. It was a thankless and sometimes dangerous job, but it was a mark of his standing in the community. He could also serve as a reeve, an official who managed certain aspects of the village or manor, or a churchwarden who was responsible for the upkeep of the parish church and its finances. The parish was the center of religious and social life, and being a churchwarden was a position of great trust. He would manage the parish funds, organize repairs to the church building, and help care for the local poor. These were not glamorous roles, but they were essential. They were the glue that held rural society together. The yeoman was a part of that glue. His economic activity also made him a pillar of the community. Because he produced a surplus, he was a seller at the local market. He brought his grain, wool, or livestock to the nearest market town to sell. This connected him to the wider economy. He was also a buyer. With the cash he earned, he would buy things he couldn't make himself: salt, iron for his tools, perhaps a piece of fine cloth for his wife, or a new pot for the kitchen. His presence at the market helped it thrive. He was also a source of local knowledge. He knew the land intimately. He knew the history of the property boundaries, the local customs, and the families who lived in the area. When disputes arose, his testimony would have carried weight. He was a keeper of the community's memory. So, the yeoman was more than just a well-off farmer or a skilled archer. He was a citizen in a meaningful sense of the word. He participated in the legal, administrative, and economic life of his parish. He wasn't a passive subject. He was an active participant in his own governance. His honesty was relied upon in the jury box. His authority was respected when he acted as constable, and his prosperity helped fuel the local economy. He was a man of substance, not just in wealth, but in character and social responsibility. He was a dependable, solid presence at the heart of English rural life. The world of the medieval yeoman could not last forever. The forces that had created him, a social structure based on land, a military dependent on the longbow, began to change. By the end of the 15th century and into the Tudor period, the yeoman's distinct role started to blur and eventually fade, though his ideal lived on. The warfare changed dramatically. The introduction and improvement of gunpowder weapons spelled the end for the longbow's supremacy. Arquebuses and cannons might have been slow to load and inaccurate at first, but they required far less training than the longbow. A lord could raise an army of musketeers in a fraction of the time it took to train a force of archers. The yeoman archer, the hero of Agincourt, became a military antique. His primary role on the battlefield was gone. The economy and the very landscape of England were also transforming. The wool trade became increasingly profitable. This led to the enclosure movement. Landowners, including the gentry and aristocracy, began to fence off common lands that had been used by everyone for grazing. They also started converting cropland into pasture for huge flocks of sheep. This process squeezed out the small landowner. The yeoman who owned 40 acres might find himself unable to compete with a neighboring lord who had enclosed thousands of acres for sheep. Many were forced to sell their land and become tenant farmers, now on much less secure, short-term leases. Others became landless laborers or drifted to the growing towns and cities in search of work. The social structure was also becoming more fluid, but in a way that worked against the traditional yeoman. A new kind of wealth, based on trade and commerce rather than just land, was emerging. A successful merchant in London could become far richer than a yeoman farmer. The old, clear lines between classes started to break down. The term Yeoman itself began to lose its specific meaning. It was still used to describe a prosperous farmer, but the military and legal distinctiveness that had defined the medieval Yeoman was fading away. He was slowly being absorbed into a broader category of a rural middle class, but even as the historical yeoman disappeared, his legend grew. He became a powerful symbol in English culture. He represented the ideal Englishman, independent, honest, hardworking, and loyal to his king, but not subservient to any lord. He was the embodiment of liberty and common sense. This image was cemented in stories and ballads. The most famous example is Robin Hood. While Robin himself was sometimes depicted as a down-on-his-luck nobleman, his band of merry men, figures like Little John and Will Scarlet, were the very picture of the yeoman ideal. They were master archers, at home in the greenwood, defying corrupt authority and defending the common man. This ideal traveled across the Atlantic to America. When the American colonies were being settled, the idea of the yeoman farmer as the perfect citizen took root. Thomas Jefferson, in particular, saw a nation of independent, landowning farmers as the foundation of a healthy republic. He believed that a man who worked his own soil was economically and politically free. He wasn't dependent on a landlord or an employer, so he could think for himself and participate in democracy without fear. This American yeoman ideal was a direct descendant of the English original. It celebrated self-reliance, hard work, and a connection to the land. So while the world of the medieval yeoman is long gone, his legacy is surprisingly durable. He was a product of a specific time and place, a man who found a space for himself between serfdom and nobility. He was defined by his freedom, his land, his bow, and his role in his community. He was a man who worked with his hands but also stood for his rights. He was the farmer who could fell a knight, the villager who could sit on a jury. He was a paradox, a common man who achieved an uncommon degree of independence and respect. In the end, he became more than just a historical figure. He became a myth, a symbol of the sturdy, freeborn individual who was the backbone of the nation.